Okay, I think we're going to get going. Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Dulce. I'm the Executive Director of the Kennebunk-Kennebunkport-Arundel Chamber, and I want to thank you all for joining us here this morning for this talk on inclusion and best practices. And we're so delighted this morning to have Gia Drew of EqualityMaine with us. And before I let Gia tell her story and take us through, I just want to give you a couple little housekeeping rules. We are recording Gia's portion of this discussion. Once we move to the Q&A portion, we are going to turn off recording, turn off Facebook so that people can ask questions and speak candidly without worrying about who's hearing and who might be interpreting things. We are going to have the portion of Gia's discussion shared on YouTube and on Facebook after this. We know we have a lot of members who couldn't join us this morning, but certainly want to hear more about it. And if you are interested in additional training, Gia and EqualityMaine provide some really nice training opportunities for other businesses and nonprofits. If you have questions as we go, feel free to put those in the chat and Gia will get to those at the end. But as for now, I'd like to introduce Gia Drew.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this. What day is it? I have no idea what day it is anymore after a year of this. Tuesday morning. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. My name is Gia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the program director for EqualityMaine, and it's awesome to see your pets in your cameras. One of mine is right over my shoulder here. So everyone gets extra bonus points for pets in the Zoom call this morning. So that's great. I've been with EqualityMaine for 8 years running their programs, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about EqualityMaine in a minute. This morning, I am zooming in from Kennebunkport, where I live on Stone Road, and I've been here for about 15 years and absolutely love living here. Been part of this community for about 20 years. I started teaching as a pet. I started teaching at the high school back in 2003 and was a high school teacher and coach for about 9 years. In that time, I actually came out as a transgender woman and transitioned on the job, which was terrifying. Becoming one of the first out transgender teachers in the state of Maine and one of the first transgender coaches in the entire country. And I will say a lot of good things happened then, but it was bumpy. A lot of folks didn't know how to be supportive, unfortunately, because there really wasn't a roadmap for employers at that time for employers how to support a transgender person in the workplace. And so in those last 10 years, a lot has happened. We are talking about all sorts of LGBTQ issues more and more regularly. There's probably someone in your life who is LGBTQ, or maybe you are LGBTQ. And the topic of transgender issues is definitely on front page news, unfortunately, these days for negative reasons, or there are bills all across this country and including here in Maine that are attacking transgender people. And so with visibility comes some pushback from community members, but we've seen some great progress at EqualityMaine here in the state of Maine, but across the country for greater LGBTQ visibility and rights. And Maine is one of those really wonderful places where people actually move to Maine because of our laws and policies and how welcoming the state can be for LGBTQ people. And so I'm really excited to talk this morning about how folks can make their businesses more inclusive of LGBTQ people. It's a big chunk of my work at EqualityMaine. I was just talking to someone earlier. Last night I was doing a training after work for farmers who are part of the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. And so I work all across the state and with many different organizations. So I'm really glad to be with you this morning. And with that said, I'm going to share my screen, and I have some slides to keep me on track, because if not, I will just ramble. Let's see if I can share my screen. There it goes. And let me pick the presentation. Fancy slides. Okay. Everyone can see okay? Give me a thumbs up if you can see the slides. Okay, great. Like I said, we're going to be talking about some best practices for LGBTQ inclusion in the workplace. Again, I'm Gia, she, her, program director at EqualityMaine. This is what we're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about. A little bit about Equality Maine if you're not familiar, why be LGBT inclusive, what does it matter to me as a employer, what are 6 or 7 best practices, and then I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, if you have questions along the way, please put them in the chat. I think that's a really, really great place to do that. So hopefully some of you have heard of Equality Maine before, but if not, that's okay. Equality Maine has been advocating on behalf of Maine's diverse LGBTQ plus community since 1984. So nearly 37 years. We've been doing this work, and Equality Maine actually started after a really horrible tragedy. In 1984, there was a young man who was murdered in Bangor, Maine. He was actually pushed off a bridge and killed for being gay. His name was Charlie Howard. He had just moved to Bangor from where he graduated from Portsmouth High School, and was killed. And a group of local community members in the Bangor area mobilized and formed a group called the Maine Lesbian Gay Political Alliance to combat hate and discrimination, but also to provide education around what it means to be LGBTQ, to build community so folks don't feel alone or isolated in a large rural state, and to fight for policies and laws to protect LGBTQ plus people. And I've been with Equality Maine now, like I said, for 8 years. And most of my work is the education side, where I do a lot of these trainings for small and large organizations and everything in between. But I also host a conference every year for teachers. And then we have a youth camp for LGBTQ plus and ally youth every summer, which is the highlight of my year for sure. And we're very busy this time of year at the State House, fighting bad bills, like I mentioned before, but also advocating for proactive positive bills. And then we have community events, a little less this year because of COVID, but we do have some events planned coming up this year as well. So if you want to learn more about Equality Maine, go to equalitymaine.org. That's a lot of resources. And one new program that we just started offering this last year, we merged with Sage Maine, which is support and advocacy for older LGBTQ adults. And now there are a lot of programs and resources for older LGBTQ adults, so you can find more information on our website as well. So why should we be concerned about LGBT inclusion in the workplace? That's usually the first question. Why does it matter knowing about who I'm working next to, or as a boss? Why do I care, about the sexual orientation or gender identity of my employees? What does it matter? Well, it matters because if we're not our true full selves and feel comfortable at work, how can we do our best job? That's probably the most important thing. But also recognizing that many of our customer base is LGBTQ themselves, or if not themselves, someone they love is LGBTQ. So I think it's important to recognize that. Unfortunately, nearly half of all LGBTQ workers in the United States are not out at work. And this is a pretty recent statistic, and it hasn't really budged all that much over the last 10 years. So 46% of LGBTQ workers are still not out at work for all sorts of reasons. And there are many different reasons on this sheet that would sort of give you the idea. I think people still hear, unfortunately, homophobic comments, transphobic comments in the workplace. Maybe people are afraid of not getting a promotion or a raise at work. So a lot of folks just downplay that aspect of their life, unfortunately, at the workplace. And it takes a lot of energy to hide who you are at work, but we're still not there yet at full inclusion in the workplace. And so that's another reason to be more informed about what it means to be LGBT, so you can be more inclusive in the workplace. It's also good for the economy. So for business owners, it's always good to know how can we be more open and inclusive. And it's not only is it just ethically a good thing to do, but it's also good for you. That the top 500 companies in the country, for the majority, are aware of how important it is to be inclusive of a diverse workforce. And that includes people who are LGBTQ. And so I think it's in everyone's best interest is to be more aware of who your employees are, who their family members are, but also your customer base as well. And so just being more open to being LGBT inclusive is good for business. So I'm going to go over these best practices in a little bit more detail, but we're going to talk about putting things in writing, understanding language, honoring names and pronouns, inclusive benefits, diversity training, employee resource groups, and the law. Not knowing where you are and what kind of business you run, it does vary. If you have a small little shop in town that you're the employee and maybe you have one part-time employee in the summer. I mean, there are some differences between really small organizations and really large organizations, and we work with really large organizations too. We actually work with some of the largest in the state. But there's something for everybody in these best practices, whether you're a small organization or a major organization, in terms of making your space more inclusive. So we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail. The first one is putting it in writing. And I think this is so important. We all talk, a lot of us talk a good game, like, yeah, of course I'm inclusive. Why wouldn't I be inclusive? Right. But when it comes down to it, it's really important to actually have your sort of stance in writing. Like I mentioned, I was on a call last night with a group of farmers, and we were talking about one really important thing is to have things in writing. And so if there's ever an incident with an employee or someone, you can always say, hey, this is in the handbook. This is what we talked about. These are our values as employers. These are the things that we believe in, whether that's, inclusivity or respect or dignity. I think it's very important you have these things in writing somewhere, and as part of an orientation program with any new employee, is that you go over, this is what we expect if you're going to be working for us or wherever the job is. And I think that is really important. And make sure that you're really explicit in that you're actually naming things like sexual orientation and gender identity in your policies. And if you want sample policies, you can actually reach out to me and I will send you some sample policies for sure. Or you can just look, like I said, a majority of the Fortune 500 companies have policies in place. And you can see here on this chart, just 20 years ago, only 3% of the companies had non-discrimination policies, where today, nearly 90% of all Fortune 500 companies have policies that protect LGBTQ plus people in the workplace. So a really huge sea change in the way businesses look at LGBTQ. Number two, using supportive language. And this is probably the place that gives people the biggest sort of trip ups or hang ups is language. And I will be the first to admit that I mess up myself, and I'm part of the community, and I can't keep up. So if you're fortunate to have a young person in your life, ask them. They'll probably give you every inside out of every different definition and identity and label you could ever think of. I was on a call the other day with a group of middle schoolers, and they were teaching me about all the different language related to LGBTQ, because so much has changed in my lifetime. I'm 54 years old. So when I was growing up, the language we used back in the 70s and 80s, some of it is very different today. And there's some terms that are just not welcome anymore as well. So I think it's very important that folks know what is appropriate, what is supportive language to use when speaking with each other, and what is not appropriate. And I think that's really important if you are an owner or you are supervising managers, is being able to coach and educate and teach those folks and know when to step in when you hear an inappropriate comment. But if you don't know the language, you may not know it's an inappropriate comment as well. So the letters themselves, LGBTQ, is a really good starting point. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. I think I misspelled this bisexual on that slide. I'll have to fix that. And I think what's happened over time is the word queer is probably the one that gives people like a pause, but hits the pause button. It's still a negative word. And when I was a kid, I was probably called queer and pushed into a locker or something like that. And it was very hurtful. And it's still very hurtful today. But that word has been reclaimed by many people in the community. And some people call themselves queer, or they're part of a queer community. And so be very gentle with the use of that word specifically. If you're not really part of that community, be very gentle with how you use it. And the word transgender is only about 25 years old as well. And growing up, there were other words I heard that we just don't use that much anymore. Words like transvestite or transsexual, those terms are just outdated. And so just be aware, follow the lead on other people. We always say just mirror. If someone identifies with a word or an identity, that's how they want to identify. Let them self-identification, I think, is really important. And lastly on here, it's actually on the top of this, is inclusive language. And this is where a lot of people trip up. It's around using language that isn't so connected to a gender, because you never know who you're talking to, especially a group of people. So I like y'all, good morning, y'all, or people, rather than saying ladies and gentlemen. It's a little old fashioned, and you never know who's going to be in your group. You may have people who are ladies and gentlemen, but you may have people who do not identify as being a woman or a man. They may be non-binary, or maybe they're questioning or going through transition. And so those terms are a little outdated today. I know some folks are really like sir and ma'am. But again, if you really don't know the person, I would avoid using gendered language like sir and ma'am unless you absolutely know that's what they like. There's a rule that I learned recently. It's not the golden rule. It is the platinum rule, which I really like. It is treat people the way they want to be treated. And I think it's a really good method. If people want to be called sir and ma'am, sure, absolutely. If someone wants to be known as gay, bi, trans, sure, absolutely. Follow their lead on how people want to be known and referred to. I think that's really important. So there's plenty more here. We actually, in our trainings, we go into deep detail on how to practice, how to use supportive language, how to correct people when you hear people using inappropriate language. And if you mess up yourself, how to apologize and move on. Part of that conversation these days revolve around a person's name and pronouns. It's really important to respect an employee's chosen name, which may be different than their legal name, and the pronouns that a person is using. So for example, I use she, her pronouns, but I have a lot of friends who don't use typical pronouns, she or he. They may use they or them pronouns as a alternative to she or he. And so there's a lot more information around names and pronouns, but I think it's really important that it's really difficult to change your name. One, you have to go to court, and that's a big barrier for people. You have to update your identification markers, and that's really hard to go and change your driver's license, your social security card, maybe your birth certificate, your health records. So it is a challenge. I think about 30% of transgender people do not have all their documentations in agreement. And so if you're in the processing part of hiring and you're doing the onboarding, just be aware that not everyone has all those documents in line. And we recommend that folks have a line for legal name, chosen name, pronouns using at work. I think those are really good things to follow. And another thing is allowing employees to include pronouns in their email signatures. That's a really great way to show you're inclusive. Maybe on a pin or a button to show you're inclusive or your pronouns. And there are many ways that you can show that you are supportive of the LGBTQ community. But names and pronouns are really important. And constantly recheck in with people, because people may be coming out at different times of their life, or maybe they'll come out while they're working with you, and you want to be inclusive and supportive of that person. Benefits is an area that we have a lot of questions about. Some of this is caught up in what the law says you have to offer, and some, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get into the legal side of this. But it is important if you're trying to attract a diverse workforce, and which would include LGBTQ plus people. You're aware of what benefits you're offering, if you offer any benefits, and that making sure that your medical coverage is inclusive of LGBTQ plus people, that you have things like parental leave and bereavement, of course, prescription drug plans, coverage for transition-related costs, maybe even a gender support plan if you're a larger employer, and support for family planning and fertility are things that a lot of LGBTQ plus people are looking for in a competitive job market. The good thing is here in the state of Maine, most private insurance covers most transition-related care. We've been working really hard over the last 10 years. So the majority of all health plans sold in the state of Maine are trans inclusive, as is the plans on the marketplace too. So if you're not offering benefits like health insurance, but you are giving some money towards buying something on the marketplace through the ACA, please you should know that those plans are all LGBT inclusive by law, which is really great. Diversity training. When the first thing that pops into anyone's head when we talk about diversity, it's usually about race, and that is very important. And so I think there are many prongs to diversity these days, whether we're talking about race, we're talking about LGBTQ, or ability, or language. I think when you are looking at diversity, you're looking at a broad spectrum of identities, and they do overlap. And I want to make sure that folks know that the folks don't just have one identity. Rarely does anyone or nobody just walks through their life with one identity. And so I think it's important to make sure you're noticing where identities intersect. But if you are thinking about doing diversity training, make sure you're hitting on many options, not just one, like race. Make sure you're thinking about other things. And in that, make sure your diversity training includes conversations around discrimination and harassment. Again, education on harmful language and how to correct people. Who's in charge if you have a management or supervisors in terms of correcting people? That does happen with larger employers. Who's responsible, and having that check-in with an employee, someone who maybe transitioned in the job, who's responsible for telling someone, well, that person uses he, him pronouns, not she, her pronouns, and you just misgendered that person. Who's in charge of correcting that person, I think is something you should probably have a conversation about to take the pressure off the employee. But there are really great strategies around that, depending on the size of your shop. Larger organizations do have resource groups, which allow employees to come together around different types of backgrounds like gender or race or ethnicity, to feel like they're have a sense of community in a large workspace. Talk about issues, but also a lot of these they're called ERGs, which is a really weird acronym. Add a lot to your work experience. You feel like you're part of a team. You feel like you could let your shoulders down a little bit and talk to people, and people understand what you're talking about. So if you are a larger employer, starting a employee-led group is a really positive thing, for sure. And we work really closely with some of these groups at larger employers. They volunteer at some of our events. They participate in Pride. And they do a lot more awareness around issues with some safety. 7, know the law. And this is probably the most complex part of this, because there are different parts to understanding the law here in Maine and across the country. You have people coming to Kennebunkport from all over the globe. And the laws where they live may be different than what the laws are here in Maine. And so that could be about the customers you're working with, but also the people you could be employing. And it's good to know that Maine is one of the most inclusive states in the country. The Maine Human Rights Act provides protection against discrimination in public accommodations. That's anything that's open to the public, like a hotel, a restaurant, a restroom. Employment is just like it says, if you're hiring people. Education, if you're a school. Housing, if you are renting an apartment, or if you have credit. So you cannot discriminate against anybody based on their actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. And I think that is really important. Not all states have this sort of nuance to it. So if someone perceives someone to be gay, for example, and they discriminate against that person, even if they're not gay, that's still discrimination. And so if someone discriminates against somebody because of the way they're dressed, maybe it's a gentleman wearing something more feminine and they get discriminated against or treated unfairly, in Maine law, that is discrimination. And so Mainers voted to amend the Human Rights Act in 2005. And so these laws have been in place for nearly 20 years. So those are not new. Unfortunately, across the country, there are no uniform federal protections for LGBTQ people, or very limited, I would say. Probably the biggest change happened just this last year in June. The Supreme Court ruled that gender identity and sexual orientation are protected in terms of employment nationally. That was historic. There were a couple cases that were working their way through the courts, and finally the Supreme Court ruled last June And so that gives broad sweeping protections for employment in terms of LGBTQ people nationwide. And so up until that point, there were still 30 states where you could be married on Saturday and fired on Monday if you were LGBTQ. That is not the case anymore in this country. So that was really historic. But there are still other places in the country where you don't have those other layers of protection, like public accommodations, which is hotels and restaurants and places like that, or education or housing or credit. And so there's actually a bill in the Senate right now, the US Senate, called the Equality Act, that is trying to make all those things become the federal protections. Who knows where that is going to go currently with the current makeup of the Senate. So we'll see. We'll see. One of the changes that I think is important, especially for the trans community and non-binary community, is 2 years ago, we worked with the Maine Human Rights Commission to update their laws. And so now single-use restrooms in public spaces like restaurants, hotels, coffee shops must be available to all sexes. And so if you have a single-use restroom in your place, like one person in, one person out, there's probably a lock on it, that restroom should be available to everybody. You can no longer have a single sex labeled on a single-use restroom. That happened in, I believe, 2019. And hopefully you got those updates from the Maine Human Rights Commission or your HR group that you're working with. I love that. I remember when I was first transitioning 10 years ago, and I was very anxious about going into restrooms in stores. And so I would like just dehydrate myself and just hold it because I was just afraid of going into restrooms because I didn't feel safe going into a restroom. So this was a big change to folks who are trans or non-binaries, to make sure that there's a safe place for someone to go wash their hands and go to the bathroom, which is really great, for sure. Another update that's been happening kind of slowly over the last 10 years is how folks can identify on identification markers on like licenses and state IDs and even birth certificates. So Maine now allows people to update their driver's license to M, F, or X. X would be non-determined or non-identified, which is really great for people. And it's a little easier these days to update those. Up until last year, you had to have a doctor sign off on that. And that is no longer the case if you're over 18. You can attest to that and change your gender marker on ID. And it's only, I think it's $5 or $10 to do that at the BMV to do that. So that's a really great change. So unfortunately, at the federal level, if you're filling out all those forms and you have to fill out a form for a federal office about someone's sex, and someone has an X marker, we still don't have an answer from the federal government yet, though I do believe they are working towards that option eventually at their federal level when you're reporting up the ladder in terms of your staff. But here in Maine, people will give you a card, a Maine license, and it may have an M, an F, and they may actually have an X on it. So just be aware of that. But even if they have those markers on there, they may not identify with those markers because maybe they haven't updated those yet. So just be aware of that. They maybe, I remember my ID had an M on it for quite a long time, up until about 10 years ago. But that's not how I felt about myself, and it's definitely not how I presented myself to the world. And so I had to clarify and correct people that this ID was a little outdated. You can also update birth certificates now in the state of Maine. That was a recent change last year or the year before. So folks can go and update their birth certificate if they were born in Maine to get an M, F, or X on their birth certificate. I know people use birth certificates in the hiring process. Just be aware that some people have not done that yet. It's different depending on the state. Not all states allow you to update or amend your birth certificate. Maine is one of those states that allow that. Most of the New England states are pretty much in agreement on a lot of these, not exactly, but pretty close. So the 6 New England states and New York and New Jersey tend to be all in agreement on a lot of these laws and policies. So we are at 8:32, which I like. This is a 30-minute presentation, a very quick introduction to how you can make your workplace a little bit more inclusive around supporting LGBTQ employees and customers. And I think we're gonna hit the pause button and take some questions.
Yep, we are going to just